Hello again. In this section I want to go over the brush palette and possibly even the alpha palette to just give you a bit of an overview on how to work with ZBrush brushes and what to expect. So we're going to kind of take this Thor model as our base and see what we can kind of come up with from there. But we're going to start over, so I'm going to select the body here. And the couple of things to note, one, when I work with a model, I'm almost always working with clay or clay tubes. And clay is a really fantastic brush because it allows you to build up geometry, really build up the surface actually, with almost no regard for the topology at all. So I could say just start to carve in here. I'm going to turn local on as well so that the last point I click is my pivot point. And it's just going to fill things in really nice as I carve into the surface by pressing Alt. I can then build back up. And it's going to build it up in a really even way. Probably the most even way of any of the brushes. All the other brushes are going to tend to get a little bit out of control. But clay tubes is just, or clay is really just adding geometry really smoothly, really cleanly. So here I'm just kind of adding in some of the muscle in there. And you can see now if I was to go in and try to do that with, say, the standard brush. Let's say I want to start to add some muscle in here. As I start to add in form, it gets to the point where if I press Alt, I'm going to start getting really muddy. And then I'm going to have to shift and smooth that out and rebuild it, which is the general process for most people prior to the clay brush. But the clay brush allows me to, say, press Alt, and I just carve in very cleanly, and I can build back up from there. But again, it really keeps the surface contour very controlled. Now, the clay brush is great for when you get in and you start just adding mass and you start to add in all the form and the basic suggestions of everything. But it can get a little clumsy when you need to get in and start to detail an area. So let's load a tool that really needs some more detailing. Okay, so we're going to load this Hercules model. And you can see I've already started to detail some of the areas. His arm, his deltoid, chest, and all of that stuff. But let's take a look at one of these legs. Do I have them divided up? Yes. So we're using polygroups here. And so I've really roughed things in with the clay brush. But right now what I want to do is I want to work with a new brush. And this is so right now what I want to do is work with a new brush, and this is Gnomon standard brush. And the special thing about this brush is, one, it's using the brush mod slider of 32 and this alpha. Really, the only thing that makes this different from a brush that you can make yourself is this alpha. So you can actually do a search at ZBrush Central to get it, Gnomon standard brush, or you can go to Ryan's sketchbook and it's on page 6. But what this brush does is kind of carve into the surface of your model really cleanly, just like butter. So this acts almost as though it's your knife. You just kind of get in there, sculpt the surface, redraw, which is what my teachers would always tell me. Whenever you get lost in your drawing, you just draw the structure back in. So here I am just kind of making sure that I'm thinking about structure in the right enough way. I'm going to just give this sartorius a little extra emphasis. Gnomon standard brush is also using the dot stroke, not the drag rectangle, but we can switch that out to freehand, and we'll get just a touch smoother of a result. So this is my knife tool to get in there and really make sure that my forms are lining up correctly, and I'm prepared to kind of move forward with this in the right way. But it's not going to be used for defining form and defining the roundness of form. For that, a lot of the times I use a combination of either the rake brush or with clay and a lot of smooth. So for example, if I wanted to really refine this leg, I might go in with the, say, rake brush right here. Make sure local's on. I might go into the brush palette, set my brush mod down to 2, and then start to sculpt across the muscle. So I pressed Alt to carve in a little bit, and what this really does is give me really fine control over the surface contour. So by looking right up the model, looking at it from below, I really get a clean sense of the overall contour and how these muscles are merging into each other. But the rake brush leaves behind, texturing, which is going to be good if that's really what you want. If you're working on, say, a fine art piece or something like that. But a lot of the times, if you're working on realistic characters, this isn't going to cut it. So then you have to work with a bit of a different process, or you can refine it this way. So I'm just going to refine a little bit more. You can certainly refine it this way, but then we're going to have to add an extra step that kind of smooths this out. Let me go in here and just carve in this area a little bit. Press Alt and carves in really nicely. I could spend just hours doing this. This is really where the meat of being a sculptor lies, is just getting in here and sculpting these cross contours. Okay, I'm definitely getting carried away here. Let's just erase some of that and pull this together. Okay, and let's clean this up. One of the ways that you can clean it up is you just use a smaller brush. Zoom in. And so your rake becomes smaller, and being smaller smooths the surface out more. You can even get some really great texturing done this way. My friend Cesar de Cole Jr. was telling me how this is a very useful process for establishing skin pores by just cross-hatching, and that was a way that makeup and visual effects artists of old, when more was done with clay, would get the texturing of skin. It's just using a really fine rake over the surface. Okay, so that's one way. The other way is you go in with clay, you go to the brush mod slider, you set that to 0, and you just start to kind of smooth this out a little bit. Press Alt, flatten it down, starts to facet it a bit. So you need to be mindful of what facets you really want. But it's going to create a nice irregular surface for you. Maybe lower my Z intensity. Another approach is just simply to smooth it out. So go to the smooth brush here, lower your Z intensity, and smooth it out. Then you can build back any form that you think you really lost. But there are several ways to kind of get this done. You just have to keep in mind that it can very well be a process where you have to do one thing and then come back in with another thing. You're not always going to get the exact surface that you want right off the bat. Traditional sculptors don't, and you shouldn't expect to either. So that's a little bit about looking at these brushes and refining the form. But we've used a couple of tools that you may or may not be familiar with. So first, what is brush mod? So brush mod really, in the simplest way, is just a modifier to a brush. If I was to go back to, say, the clay brush, and my brush mod is set to 0, let's just select a plane 3D, make polymesh 3D, and let's just divide this several times. Turn perspective on. Alright, so right now my brush mod is set to 0. Let's just send this back over. So again, brush mod set to 0. Now, if I brush on the surface, it doesn't really add any dimension to it. If I set my brush mod back to the default of 10, see how it starts to add volume. Now, if I set brush mod to 100, it's going to add even more volume. And so brush mod for the clay brush is really a height modifier. That's 10, that's 100. And what I get a lot of times after I explain that is what is the intensity? So let's say that brush mod is the height or the distance that this brush is going to kind of pull the surface. Z intensity is how fast you are traveling to get to that distance. So if I go to Z intensity 100 and I have brush mod set to 100, then all I have to do is click on the surface once, and I have it. If I set my Z intensity down to, let's say, 10, then I have to brush on the surface multiple times and go back and forth before it gets to that depth level. So again, brush mod is height, Z intensity is just how fast you're traveling to get to that height. So height for clay brush, height for clay tubes, it's height for flatten. By default, the flatten brush has a brush mod of 0, but if we increase it to 100, same thing. But if I go in and I select the standard brush, brush mod's going to do something entirely different. Let's take our brush mod to, say, 30. Let's turn frame on so we can see what it's going to do. And as I sculpt on the surface, see how it's pinching the geometry in. That's really important to be mindful of. Now if I press Alt, this is how we got really that clean line before with Damien's standard brush. But Damien's standard brush had a really nice alpha. Something similar to Alpha 39 but more refined. So you can see Alpha 39 doesn't do too shabby either. Now if we were to, say, go to the brush mod and invert that, then instead of pinch, it actually magnifies the surface. So let's get rid of this alpha so that we see that better. Turn frame on so we see that even better. But see how it just acts like a magnifier. And so what is the magnify brush useful for? Let's say you have a model that has, basic muscles kind of built up. Let's just go in, select the magnify brush itself. And it's really good for adding volume in a nice way. Give them some, lots of back. Some man boobs. Some serious bicep action. And, and,, and, 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 and Magnify is really cool for doing for adding the form in a very specific way. It's the only brush that adds form in exactly that way. So clay, we've looked at clay brush, clay tubes we've kind of suggested, we've looked at standard and the brush mod slider. But in the midst of all of this, there's a lot of brushes, but it's kind of hard to know, what brush is going to do what. So whenever I talk about brushes, I like to make sure that we're really clear about talking about brush types. And so there are a couple of default brushes in here, very specific brush types, like for example blob. Nothing else does what blob does. So let's see, do we make a polymesh, divide it several times, and where are we at? There we are. Turn perspective on. You can see how it's just perturbing the surface, but if I turn frame on, it's not really destroying the topology too much or making it turn in on itself too much. It's really cool if you come in with an alpha like alpha 25. And then you have something that looks like intestines. You can try a different alpha, see what it does. But this is a behavior that only the blob brush has. Now, from a practical standpoint, the blob brush is also really cool for beating up the surface of things. We go in and we select a spray stroke. So I'm going into the stroke quick palette and the stroke palette up here as well. Either one works. I'm going to go to spray and then just ding up the surface. Now if I was to switch my material from this gray to a metal, it already starts to look like beat up, dinged up metal. This is also pretty cool to do if you're getting in and you're sculpting concrete. We can get in and be more specific about it by using a smaller brush size. But right here you have really authentic concrete with almost no effort whatsoever. All we've done is select the blob brush, alpha 39, and the spray stroke. If we get in there real quick, we can see that's pretty solid. We layer it on top, just kind of keep stroking onto the surface of that to really beat up the area. We're in pretty good shape. So blob brush, unique behavior. Clay brush, unique behavior. Clay tubes is really just a variant of the clay brush itself. So it's not actually a default type. The way that I know this is, one, I made the brush, and two, it has an alpha. So the way you're going to know is that if a brush has an alpha palette or alpha selected, then it's not a default, it's a derivative. So gouge is a variant of the clay brush. Let's see. Mallet is a derivative. Rake is a derivative. Ram is a derivative. /2. These are all ones that were done as well, and they're just really cool, awesome brushes. In fact, we're going to look at /2 in just a sec to kind of wrap up our quick primer of these brushes themselves. But I can get the exact same behavior from clay tubes by going to clay brush, selecting alpha 28, and let's return my brush mod back to 10, and then just go over the surface. Same behavior, but it's with the clay brush. That's because the only difference the clay tubes has is this alpha. Brush mod's at the default 10. And this is also true of rake brush. Rake brush has a very specific alpha that was created. Its brush mod is by default set to 10. And the rake brush can add geometry as though it's being added with a rake, or you press Alt and it can kind of carve in as though it is a rake working with clay. Let's select a green matte cap, green clay, and see what it's like to just kind of carve into the surface. That's really useful when we get in and start working with surfaces, as we kind of saw earlier. And I just really like the texturing that it leaves behind. Very authentic. Okay, let's go on and explore some of these others. We're going to bypass displace, elastic, eye. We might take a look at flatten really quick. Flatten is a brush that I use occasionally. Let's return the brush mod to 0. That's a default. Oh, sorry. Here. And let's select our brush mod and set that back to 0. And so flatten does exactly what it says. Just flattens the surface. So pretty useful if you need to get kind of hard edges or mechanical details. And create a real mechanical perspective on that. Thigh. It's also a good brush for getting in and kind of mixing up the surface a little bit. And it also gives us a chance to talk about one other brush setting that I want to bring up, and that is the samples setting. So samples is useful for clay and flatten primarily. If we set this to, let's say, to 0, then as this brush moves across the surface of something, let's just go into 5 or Thor 50. And I want to look at just his boots. Turn everything else off. And let's say I'm just going to come in here and move across the surface. Notice how as I move across the surface it kind of gets it flips a lot right here at the edge. That has a lot to do, or everything to do with samples. Now let's return it to its default of 0.75 or right around there. As I move across, see how it's being a lot smoother. It's not flipping the geometry like that. So samples is really how much of the area around the brush is it going to include when it starts to move over and sample the normal. At 0, it basically means that it's only focused on where that red dot is, so that as I move to this corner where the surface of the strap is actually facing in a different direction, well, it flips the normal and it behaves differently. If I have it set to 75, then it's going to just average out a larger area and it's going to be a lot harder to perturb. Now if I set this to 2, then it's going to do even more of a even line. And so we found that the best behavior was really at 75. That's where you get enough randomization and are able to kind of get it a little bit loose, keep it loose. The Pixelogic team did a fantastic job putting this brush together. Now, if I go in and I have a brush mod set of something like 25, then it's going to do what the clay brush does, which is add depth. So I actually do not use the flatten brush for this. I use the clay brush, and that's primarily because of that one behavior the clay brush has of adding in, filling in the back area first. So let's just see here. See how it's just going to fill that area in before it adds too much. It's a very distinct algorithm. Okay, so inflate and magnify, two similar brushes, but inflate is going to behave differently. And that's all you really need to know, is that it's just different. So you'll try it. See how inflate's going to inflate along the normal, so it's pushing that strap out, whereas magnify is going to, in this case, does a better job of it. But magnify is not going to work very well in areas where the geometry is very close. So let's go in here and say I want to get right in here and kind of pinch these together. Magnify doesn't do too terribly well in there. But if I go in and I select inflate, inflate does a pretty awesome job of just kind of merging them in, pulling them in together. Okay, move brush, pretty apparent. The let's see, the other thing I really want to show you is the snake hook brush. So we're going to leapfrog all of these. We've looked at rake, but we're going to look at snake hook now. And what I really want to show you is a couple of quick tricks for doing some really cool rocky surfaces. So we're going to turn perspective on. We've got the snake hook. We're going to select alpha 25, and we can get some nice texturing just by going back and forth. We can also create a little rocky plateau by just pulling straight out. Pull straight out and around. Then we can go in with clay tubes, do some flattening, some building, and start to really kind of put this surface together. And so that's in my actual ZBrush for Environments workshop. Show you a couple of really cool examples of doing that. Alright, so another brush, layer. Layer has a very important feature. Let's go in with, let's take a look at Thor here. Sorry for the crotch shot. Layer will let you add one consistent layer to the model if you have a morph target stored. So I'm going to delete this, store morph target, and then notice how as I sculpt on the surface and I sculpt two intersecting lines, they don't overlap each other. Now if I'm to turn and delete this morph target, they will overlap each other. And in all other brushes, besides the clay brush, they will overlap each other. So if we store this, this will give us a chance to get in and say either carve out a section of consistent depth with multiple strokes. So I could say carve out some kind of shape for the shirt. Say we got a tear right in here. Go ahead and select this one. Okay. The thing that makes a difference in terms of how far down it pushes is whether or not where your Z intensity is. So now if I set my Z intensity to 40, it's going to actually carve in more. Set it to 10 or 16, then it's going to carve in less. And in the case where it's been pushed down further, it's actually going to bring that area up. Alright, now another brush I want to take a look at, /2, is a brush that really gives us a chance to understand how the brushes work with alphas. So brush /2 is a very simple brush. There's no changes within the brush palette, so to speak. Almost everything is being done in the alpha palette. So let's throw this off to the side. And let's take a look at what makes it work. Let's just reset that alpha curve. Set our radial fade back to 4. Set our mid value back to 0. And see what happens with this brush. So pretty much simple standard brush behavior. Not much to speak of. But let's redo what we just undid. So we're going to click and insert a point, click and insert another point, make a nice hard edge, and bada bing, we see right away that it is pulling out a hard edge. But let's return our mid value to 42, and you'll see right off the bat it does something really cool, which is that it will push in and out at the same time. And so that's really neat for getting in and sculpting certain types of form. Very useful when you get in with hair. Now radial fade is turned on and set to 4, so that it's a fairly nice edge and it's not just this hard edged thing. But we can go back and forth here. See what we come up with. Now if we come into the hair itself, let's go into my subtool, select the hair, and see how I can use that here. So I'm going to just kind of push in. Let me lower the Z intensity. And see, this is going to give me the ability to add one lock of hair really smoothly over the others. And really separate out those locks. There's really no other way to get a nice clean line like this except for a lot of just manual sculpting. Alright, another thing, and this will be the last thing that I think is really important to show you guys in terms of character work, is these stitch brushes. So stitch 2, if I come back into Thor and I go into his body, right here along the side you see I've put some stitching in. Looks like I put it in at a higher subdivision level. But let's just show you really quickly what this is doing. See how it drags out this stitching pattern, which I have along here as well. So let's take a look at how it is doing that. Number one, the alpha is important. So that's kind of key. Mid value is set to 24. So it is pushing in a little bit. Excuse me. And that's nice. Let's see in the brush palette. Is it doing anything special? No, nothing set up. But in the stroke, it does have one really important feature set, and that is the lazy mouse. And the lazy mouse is something that's going to help it create a very nice, smooth line. If I turn that off, you can see as I draw and I move my cursor around, it'll do kind of go wonky like that. Let's just go back. Increase our Z intensity. There we go. So very wonky. But now if I go back in, I turn lazy mouse on, all of that just gets evened out. And so that's coming from the lazy radius and the maxed step. So lazy radius is how many pixels ahead the stroke is going to, or this line is going to be. I can increase the lazy radius to say 30, and you see how it pulls out about 30 pixels and then starts to draw. But all we wanted to do is average it out a little bit. So we didn't really feel a need to get in there and keep a long lazy radius. If you go up to 600, you see it drags out much further and then it starts. That's too far for the purposes here. All we wanted to do is average things out, so 1 worked really well. Okay, so that's a little bit of information. Later on we'll take a look at Z project. But that's a bit of information in terms of looking at these brushes, how they work, and how they work in conjunction with alphas and the stroke palette itself.